of density, which you will see is very relevant for the universal service provision. And all these characteristics, I just focus on two of them, in turn imply that the natural are at the base of the natural monopoly argument, so that all that elements imply that a single firm supplying the whole market demand has lower production costs compared to the overall cost that two or more producers would have. So in other terms, a monopoly is more cost efficient than multi-firm production. And this argument has been at the base of the fact that many countries for a long time network industries were legal monopolies. And on one side, these in most European and the OECD countries, those monopolies were owned by the state, so state-owned national monopolies, while, for example, in other countries, as in the US, the monopolies were private, often local monopolies, which were subject to public regulation. And but I would like to describe you a timeline of network industry policy which took place in the European Union and also in other European countries. So passing from legal monopolies, state-owned, the progressive reduction or elimination of special and exclusive rights, which represent legal entry barrier and the competitors' market to entry and to compete in the market. In Europe, and from the end of the 80s and more extensively from the 90s, the legal barriers protecting monopolies progressively started to be perceived as politically undesirable and also economically unsustainable. And so from the time the economic and the policy debate focus more and more on the inefficiencies of monopolistic market structure, and in particular dynamic inefficiencies, as the monopolistic firm has lower incentive to innovate, generally speaking, compared to a company in a competitive contest. The so-called X inefficiency, according to which a monopoly has higher average cost due to the lack of competitive pressures, and more known allocative inefficiencies, so the so-called social cost of monopolies, due to which that were lost, so that which is something we study in the basic course of economics. So the loss sustained by consumers not buying the product service because of its higher prices, which is not offset by the gains of the monopolist himself. So it's a net loss of social welfare. And next to this is the opportunity cost of those resources which are directed to efforts to obtain and to keep monopoly rents. So all these economic analysis and, as I said, the political context pushed towards liberalization in most network industries. And here I have a graph in which I described the liberalization patterns in OECD countries. I calculated the liberalization, let's say, index as a proxy of the data of entry and entry barriers in each specific network industries, and I developed it through time from the mid-70s to the to 2015, let's say. And as you can see, as something it's interesting for me, that the telecommunication market, which I cannot point, maybe I'm not sure if you see the pointer here, but anyway, is the light violet line, which describes that the telecommunication industry really got to a higher level of liberalization in time, while other network industries, of course, as a lower liberalization process, and some of them very, very, very low. For example, road on our other network industries, a bit closer to the telecom industry. Sorry if I speak strangely, but I go on listening this echo, so it distracts me. But I'm getting used. So that's, okay. And so the other point that I would like to underline, and sorry if these issues are very well known and maybe too basic, but I think it's interesting in order to introduce the liberalization in the telecom market, which is a very interesting case study. And of course, there was this relationship between liberalization and privatization, and which was very interesting also in the European Union, because liberalization in most network industries was mandated by the European law, while European law is agnostic in relation about the ownership of the industry. So that from the European Union does not come any law or regulation or indication regarding privatization. So the selling of shares, anyway, the transfer of ownership from the state or anyway public bodies to private entities. And so here you have a taxonomy, which is very, and I would say most of these possible outcome are very interesting and their specific features. So the different combination between liberalized market and privatized market. And as I said, most network industries in Europe and OECD countries were liberalized. So what we have in the market is the square removal or legal barrier, while we call substantial liberalization, or in other terms, pro-competitive regulation, is the creation of the condition for new entrants to not only to legally enter, but to effectively enter and stay in the market and sustainably compete with the former incumbent. Because, as I said at the beginning, because of all of the economics of the network industries, incumbent companies, ex-former monopolists, has a very wide, large competitive advantage towards new entrants. And of course, is necessary a regulation which could reduce the economic entry barriers and create a level playing field. So market condition under which new entrants can develop a sustainable competition vis-a-vis the incumbent. And this is something that described the substantial liberalization process in OECD countries. It's a proxy of the substantial liberalization is the incumbent market share. So the more new entrants enter and acquire a sustainable position in the market, and the more the incumbent market share decreases. And so you can see that the trend still from the mid-60s, and the index is ranging from 1 to 6. So you can see from mid-70s to the 2015, the decreasing in all network industries in all OECD. This is an average of all 35 OECD countries. And as you can see, still the telecom market is one of the more in which substantially liberalized, so in which incumbents has lower market share, jointly with the Post, if I can see correctly. Yes. So this is very important to distinguish the formal liberalization from substantial liberalization. And in other terms, the substantial liberalization, as I said, is pro-competitive regulation, so putting special so-called also asymmetric regulation, so giving to the former monopolist, so the former incumbent, some special obligation only on the incumbent and not on the other companies, aim to counterbalance its market power and competitive advantage. So one of the main remedies is access regulation. So the access to the incumbent networks, the physical infrastructure, and one of the main elements, of course, is the determination and fixing access pricing. Access pricing, like antitrust enforcement, is forward-looking and must balance different objectives in the regulation. So competition promotion, but also consumer promotion, investment promotion, and this is something very relevant, of which I will talk very quickly, and universal and widespread provision of the service, technical and safety issues, and of course, competition enhancement. Another element, especially in some network industries, is network interconnection. So in addition to access regulation, and this is very relevant for telecom networks, the other fundamental upstream regulation is related to the interconnection of network, also called two-way access. And this regulation and the interconnection, involves reciprocal access between two networks that rely on each other to deliver their services. So you can think it's something less common, I guess, in energy markets, which is not my specialization, but in telecom industry, of course, is fundamental network interconnection, because it's fundamental to have more than one company in the market, so that a customer of one company can call a customer of another company. And network interconnection, differently from access regulation, is a symmetric regulatory measure, so all networks, independently from dense size and customer base, are subject to network interconnection regulation, and is a precondition for a liberalized market to function, as I said before, because you need customer of different network operators to be able to communicate each other. So in a way, in economic terms, interconnection internalizes and maximizes the network effects, which otherwise would represent an entry barrier for new competitors. If you think a very big network and another network operator entering the market, it cannot interconnect, cannot allow its small customer base to call the very big customer base of the large network. Of course, this would represent an unsurmountable entry barrier for this alternative network operator. So network interconnection internalize network externalities and maximize positive network effect in the market, allowing entrants to compete against incumbent. So going to speak more specifically to telecom market, but most of the issues I touch upon about, generally speaking, network industry are very much applicable to telecom markets. All European countries experienced a wave of liberalization starting from the late 80s and the 90s, and then rapidly reducing the peak of intervention after 2000. So you can see I represented here, let's say, the wave of liberalization. That's why I call it a wave, because there were specific years in which there was a peak of formal liberalization, so the decreasing of legal entry barrier in market. The first market which was liberalized, it was in the UK. There was two in the 80s with the creation of a duopoly, and then at the end of the 90s and the beginning 2000 in all European countries because of the directive liberalizing the sector. And here you can see in the telecom markets two different curves. One representing liberalization, so formal liberalization, and the other one with the continuous one, and the dotted one representing competition in telecom markets. So let's say the substantial liberalization. You can see the formal liberalization is proceeding and getting to a higher level, a higher index compared to competition in the market. But this is of course obvious because formal liberalization is a prerequisite of competition, introducing competition in the market. And I can see the liberalization in telecom markets as a higher level than the average of liberalization in all sectors, in all network industries. And okay, that's what I described. There was the entry liberalization, formal liberalization also in the telecom market, especially from the 90s, and then the substantial liberalization starting from 2000 with the pro-competitive asymmetric regulation. A very important element which I would like to underline is that according to this path, to get jointly with this evolutionary path, there was also the progressive establishment of independent national regulatory authorities. This is a very important element of the pro-competitive regulation, so that the regulation itself is set by an independent authorities, independent from, of course, the market players, but also independent to a certain extent to government, to national government. And this is a very, the first aspect, of course, is obvious why, because, of course, you have, especially in a liberalized market, you have to have an independent, impartial authority, so which is not favoring any of the competitors in the market. The second element is less obvious, but is very important and has acquired a lot of relevance in the policy making in the European Union. And the independence from government also has some support from economic theory, and the main argument is the ability for independent authority to express a long-term regulatory commitment. So establishing and setting a regulatory framework which is not dependent on the political cycle. So the government as an expression of one political party rather than the other. So in a way is in effect, most independent national regulatory authorities as regulatory cycle, so a mandate which is longer usually than the normal mandate and the terms of the national parliament, just because they want to create a long-term commitment, a commitment in the regulatory strategy and the regulatory approach, which can create stability and predictability to market actors, which is a prerequisite, as you well know, of planning investment with a certain predictability. And the other aspect for why an independent authority is necessary is what I mentioned to you before, because the European Union has never imposed a privatization. So in different countries, also in telecom industries, former incumbent and or anyway other market players are anyway state-owned enterprises. So, of course, having a regulator, which is still a public body, of course, but which does not take instruction from government, which is, generally speaking, the owner, or in a way the entity controlling a state-owned enterprise in the market, of course, create the separation between the control of the company and the authority which is setting the regulatory framework and the rules of the game, which is of course very important. So here, just a table which I summarized all the new regulatory approach in telecom market. The old approach, when you have a legal public monopoly, was the objective was the pursuit of public interest, generally speaking, not precisely defined, if not for the universal service aspect and the affordability of tariffs. While the new regulatory approach, the objectives are competition promotion, as for Europe, the consolidation of internal market, and in order not to create fragmentation between the rules of different European states and create a more wide internal market. To this aim, it's very important to underline that in the telecom market, the governance include some oversee power from the European Commission. So the regulatory measures which are adopted by national regulatory authority, there is a control phase in which the Commission can express its opinion, but also in some circumstances to express a veto on some draft regulatory measures. So asking the national regulatory authority to change its approach, its regulatory approach. So the promotion of consumer interest, and also the promotion of connectivity and take-up for very high capacity network, which is a very recent objective introduced by the directive in 2018. As for the institutional design, as I mentioned before, the old approach was a national central administration, or also even the regulatory function within the legal public monopolist. Now there is a national regulatory authorities independent from national government, and that subject, as I mentioned, to vertical and horizontal coordination mechanism. Vertical with the European Commission, and horizontal with the other national regulatory authorities through some European body, including all the regulator. As for the telecom market is BEREC, so the body of European regulators of electronic communication. The entry regulation in the old approach was to grant exclusive rights to a legal monopolist. New regulatory approach, as I mentioned, no legal entry barriers, but a general authorization. So in telecom market, there is a general authorization, so not a concession, and not even a individual authorization. So all companies that want to enter in the market and provide electronic communication services can do it by just simply notifying that to the national regulator. Of course, there are, especially for mobile market, there is some scarce resource as the frequency, the spectrum frequencies. So in order to be a network operator, there you have to have a concession on frequencies. But still you can provide the service at downstream level if you want to just provide services, just to implementing a business model of virtual network operator. So mobile virtual network operators called MVNO, which just access the network, so both the physical networks, so the towers, and also the network in terms of frequencies of some mobile network operators. As economic regulation, the only approach was retail price control in the old approach, so a fixing of retail price, giving some control to the incumbent the monopolist to the retail price, while the new regulatory approach, retail prices are not regulated, only upstream access regulation, what I mentioned before regarding the access regulation, so the regulation counterbalancing the former monopolist market power in order to allow new entrants to enter the market. And the regulation must be proportional to market power, so limited to what is necessary to allow competition, and not having an heavy-handed regulation without any economic justification. And economic regulation can be applied in the new regulatory approach at all upstream level in a proportional way, and only if competition law enforcement is not sufficient. This is a very interesting feature of the regulation of the and the governance of telecom markets, which in a way design the regulation as temporary. So the regulation want to promote competition, and as far as competition is taking place in the market, regulation must restrict, contain itself until at a certain point to leave room only for competition law enforcement in the market when there is no necessity to counterbalance the market power of the incumbent. And competition is assumed to discipline price and push quality innovation, as usual in the competition economics theory, and also is adopted an incentive-based regulation. So a regulation which is aimed also to push for productive efficiencies in the incumbent. So not only allowing competition, and so developing allocative efficiencies in the market and pushing for innovation, so dynamic efficiencies, but also giving incentive for the incumbent subject to access regulation to become more efficient. So I'm talking about the rate of return kind of regulation or price cap regulation. So incentive-based regulation, giving progressive incentive to the incumbent to reduce its production costs in order to have more upstream margin. A market structure, as I said, which is obvious for what I said before, the single public operator in the old regulatory approach, and multiple competing private operators in the new regulatory approach. I will skip social regulation, even though it's quite interesting. Just a point that in the old approach, of course, universal service was based on cross subsidies of the incumbent. So the cross subsidization of the incumbent from the profitable areas to areas which were not profitable, while universal service in the new regulatory approach is dealt with competition and giving some universal service obligation on one operator, which is, if it is necessary, is explicitly financed either by public subsidies or, in most cases, distributing the cost of the universal service over all the markets, over all the operators. Here are some regulatory principles which characterize the telecom markets: the flexibility, subsidiarity, and harmonization. As I said, in order to also to allow the consolidation of the internal market. And I'm going very quickly. Something which is very interesting of the telecom and peculiar of the telecom regulation is the alignment of regulation on competition law methodologies. As I said, one of the objectives is promotion of competition, and also there is a subsidiarity of regulation, which can be market, let's say, relevant markets in the telecom industries which are susceptible of ex-ante regulation are the only market which are not competitive, and where competition law is not sufficient to grant healthy competitive dynamics. But that's not the only point of alignment. Also because the regulatory approach, the access regulation in telecom markets is pretty much based on competition.
Basé sur la compétition. Est-ce que vous m'écoutez, monsieur?
Yes.
Oui, je vous écoute. Je suis vraiment désolé de vous interrompre. Vous avez juste 5 minutes pour conclure.
Oui, I was just concluding in 3 minutes.
J'étais en train de conclure. Je vais conclure en 3 minutes. Merci beaucoup. Je suis dans les temps.
Oh, perfect. And so one very interesting aspect is the fact that regulatory approach on telecom markets adopt the principle of competition law enforcement. So not only regulation is possible when competition law is not sufficient, but also regulator can regulate only markets where one operator is in significant market power. So when you have a dominant player. And also the remedies that can be imposed are pretty much the remedies that competition authorities usually applies for abuse of dominant position cases. The difference here is, of course, again, that there is no abuse of dominant position, but there is a dominant position and the risk of abusing. So the regulatory approach here is very much oriented and aimed to reduce the risk that the dominant companies can abuse of its dominant position, and at the same time counterbalancing the market power, allowing more competition, sustainable competition in the market. And the other principle is the proportionality, as I mentioned before. And so the minimal regulation, the regulators must impose the minimal regulation necessary to achieve the objectives. So there is, the idea is that there is a progressive removal of regulation towards the mere competition law approach, and also maintaining universal service obligation. This is the so-called wave of regulatory approach in telecom markets, in which you have a higher development of pro-competitive asymmetric access regulation obligation, which is progressively decreasing in time, leaving more room for competition law in the market. Okay, I pretty much concluded my presentation, and I hope it was interesting.
Avec ces phrases-là, et j'espère que c'était intéressant, et je serais ravi de recevoir des questions. Merci beaucoup, professeur, monsieur Maganelli. C'était très, très intéressant de partager avec nous votre expérience à propos du marché des télécoms. Nous allons lancer maintenant le débat. Je vais passer au français. Je suis vraiment désolé. Je vais donner des informations ici au public.
La présentation qui devait arriver juste après celle de M. Monganelli est reportée à demain matin. Et cet après-midi, avant de commencer le débat, je voudrais qu'on soit sûr, cet après-midi de 14h à 16h, on a des ateliers, il y en a 5. Réseau de l'électricité, réseau de gaz, réseau de l'eau, du transport et des télécoms. Vous devez rester là pour participer, c'est très intéressant, on a besoin de vos échanges et de votre expérience. Et juste après la pause, après les ateliers, il y a un éminent professeur américain qui va nous parler du réseau de l'eau, de son expérience dans l'eau. C'est très très important, surtout qu'on est en train de passer une vague actuellement, c'est le sujet actuel. Donc, on souhaiterait que vous soyez là, et puis cet après-midi, on vous parlera du programme de demain, Inch'Allah. Alors, le débat est ouvert. The debate is open.
Thank you, Mr. Manganelli. My question is very short. What is the impact of the price subsidy on the liberalization or privatization? Is it okay? No? Do you want me to repeat my question?
Yes, please.
What is the impact of the price subsidy on the liberalization or privatization?
Okay. Yes. Of course, if I adjust. Okay. Of course, there is the subsidies in the meaning, I guess, in the meaning of the universal services. So for maintaining the only aspect in which there is a subsidies, it's where you want to maintain universal service, so to provide the service to all customers, to all citizens at an affordable price. And of course, there is some differentiated profitability according to the demographic and geographic characteristic of each area in the country, and also because of the economy of density. As I said before, that's one of the aspects. So the more concentration you have in cities, and the more and the less costly is to provide service for each one of the individual. So there is a subsidies, and in a monopoly regime, the provision of service in unprofitable areas is financed, as I said, by cross subsidies. While in a competitive, liberalized market, we can have the development of competition in the profitable market segment, while a monopoly market structure is maintained in all other areas. So in the areas which are not profitable. And also the reduction of the expected gains of the incumbent, which are schemed by the new entrants, which are decreased by new entrants and competition by new entrants. And these two aspects prevent the cross-subsidization of the provision of services in the loss-making areas. So that's why there is the need in a liberalized market for to subsidize
Are you here, Mr. Monganelli?
Not necessarily, but there could be the need to subsidize. It could be the subsidized.
I think the signal is bad. Do you hear us?
Hello? Hello?
You are here?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
And so that's I said that subsidies as a role, if you want the network industries.
We had a good demonstration with telecom network now.
Yeah.
Okay. Other question? Une autre question?
Any other questions, please? So the speaker is speaking in Spanish or in Italian, a language that we cannot interpret or translate.
Mr. Manganelli, do you hear us?
أو اسمع فينا ولا؟ On l'a perdu?
Oui.
Mr. Monganelli?
Yes, I didn't hear the question.
Mr. Morad Al-Wadah from the Commission of Patron. So the speaker is speaking in Italian or in Spanish, and I cannot translate from Italian or Spanish. I'm so sorry. So, Mr. Morad Al-Wadah, the President of the National Commission of Renewable Energies. Do you hear me, Mr.? Do you hear me, please?
Yes,
Can you
I
confirm
can.
if you hear me? So, do you know the Algerian market of energies? Please, do you know? Are you familiar with the Algerian renewable energies market?
Me, no, I'm not. No.
Possible de poser la question. Pourquoi?
So I cannot ask the question since you don't know the Algerian market. It's impossible to ask the question since you don't know it very well. Thank you very much. And I can ask the question in English, says the moderator, if the presenter doesn't hear the language.
Do you know very well the Algerian market? If no, which advice you can give us?
Sorry, it was a question for me?
Yeah, in telecom market, please.
Okay. Telecom market. I'm not so familiar with the regulatory framework in Algeria, but I think the European framework is a very good regulatory framework, and so it's something that could be considered as a benchmark. So if you think that could be a good policy example for the regulation of telecom industry.
Okay, thank you. Other question? I have a question for you, Mr.
Yes.
The liberalization is very nice, is very good. We open all infrastructure in the telecom. My question, in the value chain, you have the upstream, downstream, and the network. With your experience, is it open today to liberalize the network, or to give it just between the state hand?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and that's, I would say, also in Europe there was a trend at the beginning of liberalization, also the network, but then with the new investment necessary for the fiber network, they developed a very big debate of the role of the state again in the network. Because of course liberalization, it's much easier when you have all the investment already done, but when you have a very big large investment to be carried out, as for the transformation of the network in a from copper network to a fiber network, the role of the state come back as very relevant again. So there is a huge debate also in Europe now about the role of the state, especially in Italy also, the role of the state as potential owner of a network, upstream network, giving access to competitors and to operators which provide service downstream at retail level. So there is a very much divided public opinion about it. So that's a very actual and relevant question and issue.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Une autre question?
Any other questions? One last question. No questions. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Muganele, thank you very much.
I thank you very much.
Very, very nice. I am happy to have to join with you some questions. Thank you, Mister.
Thank you. It was very nice.
Alors, il va y avoir.
So now we will break for lunch. So we have 5 workshops. So please go ahead and take part in the workshops because you are experts and we want you to come up with recommendations and with proposals. This is the aim of this meeting. Thank you very much for your kind attention. So I had a conference with Neil Crick, an American expert. So we shouldn't miss the conference or the communication. So, and the interpretation is ensured in this communication. Thank you very much and have good lunch. Thank you.
Recording has stopped.